My name is Matthew, and I've been a trucker for about 15 years now. When you've been on the road as long as I have, the miles start to blend together, the routes become second nature, and you get used to the solitude. There's something about being behind the wheel, just you, your truck, and the road ahead. That's where I've always felt most comfortable, until that night, 7 years ago, when everything changed. I've always prided myself on being able to outwork the younger guys coming into the industry. Sure, they've got energy on their side, but I've got experience. And in this line of work, experience counts for a lot. I've pushed myself harder than most, taking on as many jobs as possible, often on barely any sleep. It's not the smartest thing to do, I know, but it's what I had to do to stay competitive. That particular week had been especially brutal. I'd been working non-stop, taking on back-to-back jobs, hardly getting any rest in between. I'd just finished one job the day before and was already gearing up for the next one, a delivery from Susanville, California, to said Valley Reservoir, just off State Route 139. This route was familiar to me. I'd driven it more times than I could count. It wasn't exactly an easy drive in my condition, but it was one I knew well, which made it manageable. The plan was simple: start the job around 1 a.m., push through the night, and make the delivery by morning. After that, I'd catch a few hours of sleep before heading out on another long haul that evening, which was a particularly tough job because it was a 12-hour-plus drive. It was going to be a tough few days, but nothing I hadn't handled before. I remember that night vividly. I had my lunch, packed up my things, and hit the road a little after 1 a.m. The air was crisp, the sky was clear, and the road was empty, just the way I liked it. Everything was going smoothly at first. The hum of the engine, the occasional flicker of headlights from a distant car, and the rhythmic bounce of the truck on the uneven pavement were almost comforting. But as the hours ticked by, I started to feel the familiar tug of exhaustion. I've always been pretty good at pushing through fatigue. It's just part of the job. But that night, for some reason, it hit me harder than usual. My eyelids were getting heavier, and my focus was starting to slip. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I just needed to make it a few more hours, but it wasn't working. The road started to blur, and before I knew it, I drifted into the opposite lane, nearly colliding with an oncoming car. The blaring horn jolted me awake, and my heart was pounding in my chest. That was my wake-up call. I knew I couldn't keep going like that. I needed to pull over and take a quick nap, even if it meant throwing off my schedule. There was a campground I'd passed a few times before, just a little way off the road. It wasn't the most glamorous spot, but it was quiet and secluded, perfect for a quick rest. I figured I'd stop there for an hour, maybe two, just long enough to clear my head and regain my focus. I found the turnoff to the campground without much trouble and pulled my truck into an empty spot near the edge of the woods. The place was deserted, as I expected it would be at that hour. I parked the truck, turned off the engine, and opened the door to let in some fresh air. The cool breeze felt good against my face, and I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes. It didn't take long for sleep to claim me. I don't know how long I was out, but it couldn't have been more than an hour when my phone alarm went off. I felt surprisingly refreshed, all things considered. I stretched, rubbed the sleep from my eyes, and decided to take a quick pee break before hitting the road again. I grabbed my knife, just a habit more than anything else, and stepped out of the truck. It was pitch black outside, the kind of darkness that swallows everything whole. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, so I used my phone's flashlight to guide the way. The campground was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I made my way to the edge of the woods, taking care of business as quickly as possible. Just as I was about to head back to the truck, something caught my eye, a flash of color in the bushes nearby. I moved the light closer, trying to make out what it was. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I realized it was a suitcase, a large, sky blue suitcase, just sitting there in the middle of nowhere. It was empty, the zipper half open as if someone had rifled through it in a hurry. I felt a chill run down my spine. What the hell was a suitcase doing out here in the middle of the woods? A few meters ahead, something else caught my eye, a red dress, draped over a fallen log. It looked like it had been there for a while, the fabric torn and dirty. My gut told me something was seriously wrong, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate a little further. I walked deeper into the woods, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The further I went, the more unnerved I became. There were clothes scattered everywhere, shirts, pants, shoes, all in different sizes and styles. Some were neatly folded, others were strewn about haphazardly. There were bags, backpacks, even a few toys mixed in with the mess. It looked like someone had dumped the contents of several suitcases all over the place. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew I shouldn't be there. Whatever had happened in those woods, it wasn't something I wanted to get involved in. I turned around, ready to head back to my truck and call the police, but before I could take a step, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched and desperate. It sounded like she was in pain, like she was being attacked. For a moment, I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to get the hell out of there and never look back. But I couldn't just leave her. What if she needed help? What if she was hurt? I hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the need to help. Then, a second scream broke through my indecision. And I knew I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on my knife, and ran in the direction of the sound. The woods were dense, the underbrush thick and tangled. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I pushed through, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly with every step. The screams grew louder, more frantic, and I followed them, my heart racing. I didn't know what I was going to find, but I had to keep going. Finally, I broke through the trees into a small clearing, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There was no woman, no attacker, just a Bluetooth speaker hanging from a tree branch, blaring out the recorded screams on a loop. Below it, lying on the ground, was a broken smartphone, the screen cracked and flickering. I stared at the setup, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It was a trap, plain and simple. Someone had lured me into the woods with a fake distress call, and I had walked right into it. I needed to get out of there, and fast. I turned and sprinted back the way I came, my feet pounding the forest floor. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins, pushing me forward even as my body screamed for rest. As I ran, I heard something behind me, footsteps, getting closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, focusing on the light of my truck in the distance, the only thing that mattered. I reached the truck, my chest heaving with exertion, and flung open the door. I scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly it took me a few tries to get the key in the ignition. Finally, the engine started, and I floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped out of the campground. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, a group of 8 or 10 people, all wearing dark hoodies, standing by the side of the road. They didn't chase after me. They just stood there, watching as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road where the lights of civilization started to appear. My hands were still shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew I needed to call the police, but I was afraid that by the time they got there, whoever those people were would be long gone. I completed my delivery, though I can't remember much of it. I was running on pure adrenaline, my mind still stuck in those woods. When I finally parked the truck, I called the police and canceled my next job to help with the investigation. But the next morning, there was nothing. The police searched the area thoroughly, but there was absolutely nothing of what I saw, no suitcases, no dresses, nothing. It was like nothing had ever been there, just simple woods. I avoid campgrounds like the plague now. I've thought about what might have happened if I hadn't woken up in time, if I hadn't run when I did. I'm just glad I'll never have to find out. I've been driving trucks for nearly 10 years now, but there's one trip that still haunts me. It was supposed to be just another job, a long haul from Chicago, Illinois, to West Virginia during one of the harshest winters I can remember. The roads were a mess, with ice and snow making every mile feel like a battle. But I was determined to get the job done. I needed the money, especially with Christmas around the corner. My family was counting on me. That year had been rough. I'd been fired from my previous job at the beginning of the year and had only recently secured a position at a small transportation firm. I was grateful for the work, but it wasn't easy. The hours were long, and the jobs were relentless. This trip was the last one before I could take a few days off for the holidays, and I was desperate to get it over with. The plan was to deliver a load from Chicago to West Virginia, pick up another one, and then drive to Pennsylvania. The entire journey would take about 13 hours, and I was already exhausted before I even started. I'd been working non-stop all week, trying to make as much as I could. The cold didn't help either. It was the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made you want to crawl into bed and never leave. I set out late in the evening, hoping to reach West Virginia by early morning and then continue on to Pennsylvania. The roads were empty, just the way I liked them, and I had a few energy drinks to keep me going. The first few hours went by in a blur of snow and darkness. I cranked up the heat in the cab, trying to stay warm and alert. But fatigue was setting in fast. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, making my eyelids heavy. I reached for another can of Red Bull, only to realize I was out. I cursed under my breath, knowing I'd have to stop somewhere soon. I had two choices: pull over and take a nap, which would mean losing precious hours, or find a store and stock up on more energy drinks. I chose the latter, even though I knew it might take longer than I wanted. After driving for a few more minutes, I saw a service stop up ahead. The lights were on, and I figured I'd be in and out in no time. I pulled the truck into the lot and parked near the convenience store. It was eerily quiet, with only a single car in the lot and a young guy working the counter inside. I grabbed a couple of cans of Red Bull, some chips, and a few other snacks to keep me going. As I was heading back to my truck, I noticed a woman standing nearby, peering into the cab. She looked out of place, bundled up in a thick coat with a scarf wrapped around her face. Curious, I walked over and asked if she needed help. She turned to me, her eyes wide and a little frantic. She asked if I was the driver, and when I nodded, she explained that her husband was supposed to pick her up to take her home to West Virginia, but his car had broken down earlier that day. She had only gotten the news a few hours ago and was now stranded. She introduced herself as Karen. She mentioned she'd been in Chicago for work and was desperate to get back home to her 15-year-old daughter in West Virginia for Christmas. There was something about the way she spoke, something that tugged at my heartstrings. Maybe it was because I had a daughter the same age, or maybe it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on me, but I felt a sense of empathy for her. Still, I wasn't about to let a stranger into my truck without checking things out first. I told Karen to wait while I went back inside the store. The guy at the counter was busy with something behind the register, but I asked him if he knew anything about the woman outside. He looked up, puzzled, and said he hadn't seen anyone else around. That didn't exactly put me at ease, but I figured she was harmless enough. I went back out and invited Karen into the truck. She seemed genuinely relieved, thanking me repeatedly as she climbed into the passenger seat. We set off again, the snow still falling heavily, and the road stretching out before us like a never-ending ribbon of white. The cab was warm, and the hum of the engine was almost soothing. Karen and I made small talk as we drove, mostly about her daughter and how much she missed her. She asked me about my job, and I told her about the grueling week I'd had and how I was looking forward to getting home for the holidays. I could feel the energy drink kicking in, giving me a temporary boost of alertness. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint humming noise coming from the back of the truck. It was so quiet at first that I thought I'd imagined it. I glanced in the rearview mirror but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I shook it off, chalking it up to the wind or maybe the truck's engine. A few minutes later, the humming came again, this time a little louder. It almost sounded like people talking, but it was too muffled to make out any words. I asked Karen if she heard anything, but she just looked at me, confused, and said she hadn't heard a thing. I dismissed it again, taking a few more sips of my Red Bull. But the humming wouldn't stop. It seemed to come and go in waves, each time a little more distinct than the last. I started to feel uneasy, like something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. Karen kept talking, her voice a constant background noise as I focused on the road ahead. Every time the humming started, she would change the subject, talking about something completely unrelated. It was strange, but I was too tired to really think about it. As we got closer to West Virginia, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I found myself speeding up, eager to drop Karen off and finish my delivery. The snow was coming down harder now, and the roads were getting more treacherous by the minute. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something out of place, but there was nothing there. Finally, just as we were about to cross into West Virginia, a police car pulled up behind me, lights flashing. I cursed under my breath and pulled over to the side of the road. The last thing I needed was a ticket, but I was speeding. Two officers got out of the car and approached the truck. One of them asked for my license and registration while the other went around to the passenger side to talk to Karen. I handed over my paperwork, trying to keep calm, but my heart was racing. The officer questioning me seemed suspicious, asking a lot of questions about where I was headed and what I was hauling. He then asked if he could check the back of the truck. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he was expecting to find, but eventually nodded and handed him the keys. What happened next still makes my blood run cold. The officer opened the back of the truck and immediately called for backup. Within minutes, more police cars arrived, and they began pulling people out of the truck. 3 of them, a man with a kitchen knife, a teenage girl, and a young man in his early 20s, were all homeless. Their clothes were dirty and torn, and they looked like they hadn't eaten in days. Karen was also arrested. She had been carrying a knife the entire time, hidden in her coat. I was in shock, unable to process what was happening. The police later told me that the group had been trying to hitch a ride to West Virginia, and Karen had somehow convinced them to hide in the back of my truck. I was taken to the police station, where I had to explain the whole situation. After hours of paperwork and a call to my transportation firm, they finally let me go. But the damage was done. My firm fired me the next day, citing the incident as a major breach of trust. 7 years have passed since that night, and I'm still driving trucks. But I've never stopped to pick up at anyone again. That night could have ended much worse than it did, and I still think about how close I came to losing everything. It's a memory that will stay with me for the rest of my life. Have you ever had a night on the road that still haunts you, no matter how many miles you've driven since? Being a trucker means a lot of traveling, driving day and night, but I still think about that night, trying to find an explanation for what I saw. I've been driving trucks for over 20 years, but one night back in 2014 still haunts me. It was late, maybe around 2 a.m., and I was hauling a load from San Diego to Arizona on Interstate 8. The stretch through the Sonoran Desert is something else, nothing but endless blackness, with the occasional cactus or rock formation illuminated by your headlights. It was just me, the road, and the humming of the truck's engine. I can't remember exactly what I was delivering, something for a shop in Arizona, but that's not what stuck with me. The highway was dead. No cars in sight, no lights from nearby towns, just pitch-black darkness. Delivery was on a tight schedule, and the pay was good, way too good to pass up. Money was tight back then, and I needed every dollar I could get. So, despite the creepy atmosphere, I floored it, determined to get to Arizona on time. About an hour in, I started feeling uneasy. I'm not the kind of guy to get spooked easily, 20 years on the road toughens you up, but there was something about that night. The silence was oppressive and I was exhausted, but I kept my eyes on the road. Then I saw a glimmer of light in the distance, like a reflection or maybe a headlight. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal crossing the road, it was a car. A Ford Mustang GT, just sitting there in the middle of the highway. My dream car, but not exactly what you want to see at that moment. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I brought the truck to a halt just a few feet from it. I was pissed. What kind of idiot parks in the middle of the road in the dead of night? I leaned out the window and shouted, but no one answered. The car just sat there, engine off, with its driver's side door slightly ajar. That's when my anger turned into something else, curiosity mixed with a bit of fear. I grabbed my flashlight and got out, the desert air cool against my skin. I walked up to the Mustang, expecting to find some drunk passed out in the driver's seat. But when I looked inside, there was no one. The car was empty. The door was open, the keys were in the ignition, and there were a couple of beer cans and some burger wrappers scattered on the passenger seat. But no driver, no sign of anyone. I'm not a superstitious guy, but something about the situation felt off. Way off. I decided to call for help. As I reached into my pocket for my phone, I heard it, a scream, loud and frustrated, like someone had just realized they'd screwed up big time. Shit. The voice was close, too close. I jerked my head up, slamming it against the roof of the car in the process. Pain shot through my skull, but I was too rattled to care. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of the person who'd screamed. That's when I decided I was done playing detective. I needed to get out of there and find some help. I started back towards my truck, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. Then, out of nowhere, a gunshot rang out. The loudest gunshot I've ever heard, echoing across the desert like a clap of thunder. My heart nearly exploded out of my chest. I froze, instinctively ducking down as I looked around, trying to figure out where the shot had come from. But the desert was silent again, as if nothing had happened. Then I heard a voice, this time clear and close. "Hey, what are you doing near my car?" My blood ran cold. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice was coming from the direction of the Mustang. I didn't wait to see who it was or what they wanted. I bolted towards my truck, my boots slipping on the gravel as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. I threw myself into the cab and slammed the door shut, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start the engine. My hands were shaking so bad it took a few tries, but finally, the engine roared to life. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, nearly clipping the Mustang as I sped past it. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the guy chasing after me. And I did see something, someone, actually. A man standing next to the Mustang, holding a large suitcase in one hand and a gun in the other. He just stood there, watching me drive away, his face expressionless in the darkness. I kept driving, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. But after a few miles, I didn't see him anymore. The desert was empty again, and I started to calm down. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I could just forget about the whole thing and focus on finishing the delivery. But just when I thought I was in the clear, I heard it, the roar of an engine. I looked in the mirror again, and there it was, the Mustang, headlights blazing, speeding towards me. My heart sank. The guy was coming after me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands trembling as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. The operator's voice was calm, too calm, as they told me to keep driving and that a patrol car was stationed just up the road, about half a mile ahead. I didn't need to be told twice. I floored the accelerator, the truck rattling as I pushed it to its limits. And sure enough, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car on the side of the road. I pulled over, my tires kicking up dust as I came to a stop next to the patrol car. An officer stepped out, hand on his holster, and walked up to my window. I must have looked like a madman, babbling about the Mustang and the guy with the gun. The officer tried to calm me down, asking for details about what had happened. But I couldn't take my eyes off the road behind me, waiting for the Mustang to appear. And then it did. Roaring past us like a bat out of hell. I shouted at the officer, telling him to go after it, but he just stood there, jotting down notes in his little notebook. It was infuriating, but what could I do? The officer assured me they'd look into it, that they'd send out a search party or whatever. 2 years passed, and I never heard back from the police. No follow-up, no closure. I've told the story to my friends, other truckers, but no one has a good explanation. I still think about it, especially when I'm driving at night on those long, empty stretches of highway. I still drive trucks, still make deliveries, but I avoid that stretch of Interstate 8 whenever I can.